Hello everyone. Welcome to our virtual event space. So my name is Allie and I'm your host for this evening. And I am so excited to be introducing Tom Kerns and Kathleen Dean Moore here to discuss their book, Bearing Witness, the Human Rights Case Against Fracking and Climate Change. But before we get into the good stuff, I just want to quickly thank you all so much for tuning in. As much as we miss having you all in the bookstore, it has been such a delight to expand this online program to connect readers and authors in a virtual space. So thank you all so much for tuning in and for buying books. Your support is what makes all of this possible. So I will be linking directly to books in the chat all evening, so it'll be super easy to go find them. For those of you in the Seattle area, come on in. All three of our locations are open. Or you can place an order online and come pick them up in store. Or if you're not local, we do ship. And once again, we are so grateful for your support. While you're over on our website, I definitely encourage you to check out some of our other upcoming events. We have an exciting roster coming up in the next few months. And if you'd like to stay in touch with our community, you can sign up for our newsletter. It's a weekly update about events and exciting releases, our online book clubs, and of course, follow us on any of the major social media platforms. We are at Third Place Books for the quickest updates and recommendations. Speaking of social media, if you'd like to check out some of our past virtual events, you can find most of them on our YouTube channel, including this event within the next 48 hours. So if you'd like to see our other virtual events or share this one, go ahead and track us down over there. So we are here for about an hour, and towards the end, we will be taking questions. So if you have any questions, which we very much hope that you do, go ahead and leave those in the Q&A box, which should be either at the top or bottom of your screen. It is different than the chat box, which is great for virtual applause and connecting with each other. We would love to know where you are from or your favorite latest read, but when it comes time for questions, please do make sure those end up in the Q&A so we can most easily find them. Before we get started, I would like to remind everyone of our commitment to ensuring the safety and well-being of event attendees and guest authors. So in our chat and question spaces, please do lead with kindness and refrain from any inappropriate behavior or harassment. So there are auto-generated closed captions available from the menu at the top or bottom of the screen. Select the live transcript button to enable or disable them. And finally, should any technical issues arise, which, you know, this is Zoom, things happen, we will work as quickly as we can to resolve them. And we appreciate your patience and understanding. And I believe that that is all of my housekeeping. So without further ado, tonight we are here to discuss Bearing Witness, which is a collection of essays about the International Human Rights Court that in 2018 ruled that fracking systematically violates substantive and procedural human rights. I am so thrilled to introduce the editors of Bearing Witness. First, Tom Kerns, Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at North Seattle College, who is Director of Environment and Human Rights Advisory. In 2015, he helped draft the International Declaration of Human Rights and Climate Change. He co-organized the International Tribunal of Human Rights, Fracking, and Climate Change, which provides the substance of this book. For more information about Tom's climate work, please go to www.youthclimatecourts.org, and I will link that in the chat. Next, welcome Kathleen Dean Moore, a moral philosopher, environmental activist, and award-winning author or editor of dozens of books, including Moral Ground and Great Tide Rising. In order to write and speak about the moral urgency of climate action, she left her longtime position as Distinguished Professor of Environmental Philosophy at Oregon State University. For more information about Kathleen's climate work, please go to www.riverwalking.com, and I will link that as well. So thank you both for being here. I am so excited to listen in on this conversation. If you need anything, of course, give me a shout, and that goes for everyone in the audience as well. I will be in chat. And with that, I'm going to pass the stage to our authors. So welcome, both of you.
Thank you, Allie. Hi, Tom.
Hi, Kathy.
Allie is a genius at this work, and I'm so glad that she is, because neither Tom nor I can claim that title. We are here to talk about bearing witness, the human rights case against fracking and climate change. And I have to say that of all the books that I've done and Tom has done, I've never felt that there was a book as important for this particular time as this book is. As you all know, I mean, it has escaped no one's attention that we are living at an extraordinary time. Unbelievable to find ourselves here. The planet is simultaneously approaching two tipping points. On the one hand, the planet is barreling towards levels of global warming and ecosystem collapse that could tip it into conditions that cannot support civilizations. On the other hand, and at the same time, the planet is approaching these new levels of concern for human rights and the rights of human future beings, which could tip it into a new moral order. A new moral order that's committed to a larger regard for human rights, committed to environmental justice, an order that could finally revoke the social license of the fossil fuel industry to crash the planetary systems that sustain human life. So here we are. It could go either way. Into this moment, we want to introduce the power of a human rights story, the power of human rights discourse or narrative to turn the tide, to make it almost unthinkable that fossil fuel companies could do what they are doing to people and to the planet. So we're seeing that there's a growing number of human rights cases all around the world that accuse the fossil fuel industry of massive violations of human rights. You probably have heard that Greta Thunberg and 16 of her colleagues and friends are bringing an action before the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child, accusing fossil fuel industry of violating the rights of children. And in the Netherlands, the Friends of the Earth just won an incredible settlement that requires Royal Dutch Shell to reduce its carbon dioxide emissions and the emissions of its consumers as well, by 45% in 10 years. So these are new cases that are trying to control fossil fuel industry depredations by appealing to internationally agreed upon human rights. So we're here tonight because there is, in fact, a very important but little known precedent for this kind of a case. And 3 years ago, the highly respected Permanent People's Tribunal, which is an international human rights court based in Rome, weighed the actions of governments and fossil fuel giants against the standards of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They found that fracking and climate change create serious, quoting, and catastrophic, quoting, violations of human rights that are inherent in the industry. Fracking, they ruled, should be banned. Now, the book we are bringing to you tonight then tells the story of that tribunal, and it tells about the eyewitness testimony and the legal and moral testimony that supported the tribunal's opinion. As I say, the book could not come at a more pivotal time, a hinge point in history that we find ourselves in. And in little more than a month, the nations are going to gather in Glasgow at COP26. And that's the meeting that may well decide which way the world tips. This is a good chance. It may be a last chance to call the world's attention to the moral and legal failure of governments to protect the citizens' rights against the fossil fuel industry. So COP26 can try them in the court of public opinion for what's becoming the greatest violation of human rights the world has ever seen. And what we hope is that this book is going to help provide a powerful new framework, new moral arguments, new legal arguments, new eyewitness testimony that will help people make that case. So Tom, talk to us, will you, about the book, the cover, the audience, the purpose, what's going on in this book?
Well, the cover,
Yeah.
the cover is stunning, isn't it? I mean, so Kathleen gets credit for this because she found Jill Pelto, the artist, whose environmental art was on the cover of Time magazine back in COP24 2 years ago. We talked to Jill, and she was anxious to let us buy this and use it on their cover. It's forest fire, obviously, and then behind it is that famous graph of the increase of CO2 in the atmosphere over the last many decades. So we're going to see a film in a few minutes, or a part of a film in a few minutes, a little chunk of it, that was put together by the Spring Creek Project at Oregon State University. Kathleen is the head screenwriter for this film. And so in that, you're going to learn about a little more about the Tribunal and a little more about the book. So the only thing I'm going to say about it right now is that it's not a collection of essays at all. I've seen it described that way in a couple places, and it's not that at all. But it's got lots of different voices in it. Witnesses who are coming forward to testify about how they've been impacted by fracking and climate. And it's got the legal and moral experts, many of them attorneys, and it's got the judges expressing their findings. And it's got, we had a series of lectures before the Tribunal called the Bedrock Lectures on Human Rights and Climate Change, once a week, online, every week leading up to the Tribunal. And we've chosen some of those and included them in this book. So this is such a rich, complex piece of work that we had trouble figuring out how best to organize it, and ended up with, I think, a piece of art. I was telling Kathleen how much I just loved our table of contents. I think it's a piece of art. And her response was, I think tables of contents are often poems. They look like poems because they say something important and meaningful in a short space. And so I think you're going to find when you get the book and look at this table of contents that it's organized by rights, basically. So right to health, right to water, right to participation, right to adequate standard of living, and so on. And under each of those rights, we describe what the right is. We quote human rights law and maybe say a word or two about what it means. That's all in a half a page or so. And then we have a series of eyewitnesses who testify what they have experienced at the hands of fossil fuel extraction processes and face of climate change. And then we have testimony from legal and moral experts, many of them attorneys. And then we have the findings, a synopsis of the findings that the judges found on that particular right. And then we cap it off with a credo, one of these lecturers that spoken leading up to the Tribunal. So that's about it. How do we expect people to read it? Not really from page 1 all the way to the end. You'll pick it up and probably read the preface and introduction just because they're so beautifully written. And then you'll probably jump to rights that look interesting to you, or to testimony that looks interesting to you, or to credos. So that's how we expect people to look at it. So now I think our job is to read some snippets.
Yeah, that's right, because this is a book event, and the traditional thing to do in a book event is do a reading, but this is a non-traditional book, so maybe just a little snippet there, Tom, and then I'll add mine so that people can get a kind of taste of the flavor.
Okay, let me find it here. So this is from the preface, right at the beginning. We have come together to ask a potentially paradigm-shifting question. How is the world's view of fracking and climate change transformed when they're seen through the lens of human rights? Answers come into sharper focus in the light of the recent advisory opinion of the special session of the Permanent People's Tribunal on Human Rights, Fracking, and Climate Change, and the testimony, arguments, and analysis on which the panel of judges based its ruling. So the case addressed by the Permanent People's Tribunal is in many respects unique and groundbreaking. In the words of the advisory opinion, here's what the judges said: this case details and critically interrogates the long path of destruction occasioned on a fragile Earth system and on all beings as a result of critically harmful activities of governments and the fossil fuel industry. It's the first case in the history of the tribunal to explicitly and comprehensively link environmental degradation and infringements of human and other rights, and to thoroughly investigate that connection. And then we add, in producing this book, our goals are twofold. First, to present from this record the most powerfully moving eyewitness testimony, the most cogent arguments, the most lucid statements of the primacy of human rights, and the most inspiring visions of what it might mean to the world when rights-based, ecocultural thriving supplants private wealth as civilization's highest achievement. And our second goal is to put these resources into the hands of people and organizations who are out there defending the future.
That's exactly it. And you know, I'll read a real quick paragraph because we're a little bit behind time here. But this is what I would say. I chose this piece. A rights approach to fracking and climate change highlights the necessary connection between human well-being and environmental thriving. Life is perilous, liberty is meaningless, and security of person is impossible on a scorched planet whose life support systems are collapsing. However, the full manifestation of human potential is nurtured by fertile soil, reliable rain, abundant food, and stable temperatures, as civilizations have found again and again. Recognizing the interdependence of human thriving and ecosystem thriving, a rights approach dissolves the human-nature dichotomy that has paralyzed effective collaborations between social justice and environmental movements, and transforms global warming into a moral issue called by a relatively new term, climate justice.
Amen.
Along with this, with the leadership of the Spring Creek Project at Oregon State, we created a film that tells the story of the tribunal, and we'd like to show you a 20-minute segment of that film. And then we'll come back and we'll talk about particular rights in the time that's remaining to us. So hang here for just a second. I will show you this. I will give you sound. Okay, and then I will start it.
They don't see that we have to breathe in these gases or we have to deal with these safety violations.
Great.
We as residents have to deal with this 24/7 because this activity takes place 24/7. It's not an 8 to 5 Monday through Friday job. And I think people need to know that just these stresses that we go through every day shouldn't be there. And these stresses are new. Okay, so thank you. I really thank all of you.
We understand that climate change poses a grave and growing danger to the future. What we are now also coming to understand is that the climate crisis is the greatest threat to human rights the world has ever seen. Right to life, health, and security of person are being violated. Not just will be violated, but already are massively violated all around the world. Governments, the very institutions charged with protecting their citizens' rights, are not only failing spectacularly spectacularly to meet that responsibility, but are deeply complicit in those violations. It's hard to know where to turn. So I was paying attention when my colleagues told me that they were calling for a special session of an international human rights tribunal to hear a rights-based case against fracking and climate change. The tribunal would bypass state and local authorities and appeal directly to universal standards of human decency. The organization I head, the Spring Creek Project at Oregon State University, stepped in to help stage the tribunal, bringing together the international panel of judges, the eyewitness testimony from people on the front lines of fracking, and the arguments of human rights attorneys and moral thought leaders from around the world. In 2018, we live streamed the tribunal, a global first, with the intent to involve as many voices as possible, as equitably as possible, rich and poor, near and remote. After a long deliberation, the tribunal has issued its ruling. It reaches damning conclusions about the human rights violations of oil and gas companies, undeterred, in fact, enabled by governments. The tribunal's ruling offers powerful, transformative, and desperately needed new tools to help rein in governments and corporations that have so far been operating with few legal or moral constraints. It does this in two important ways. First, the ruling is a determination by a respected international court that fracking and climate change constitute massive violations of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And second, the rights-based narrative reveals that fracking and climate change are grave issues of environmental justice. The human rights story could start anywhere in the world, but let's start in the Bakken oil fields of North Dakota.
Oil is dirty business. In the Bakken, spills, pipeline breaks, and well blowouts are frequent. According to the New York Times, between 2006 and 2014, an estimated 18.4 million gallons of oil and chemicals were spilled, leaked, or misted into the air, soil, and waters of North Dakota. Since 2014, a study of incident reports shows that spills, large and small, continue to happen at a rate of 1 every 1.7 days. And all of this in a rural region where most people depend on well water, groundwater. If you drive through the Bakken, you will see flares coming out of the ground beside the pump jacks, emitting fumes that deliver payloads of CO2 into the atmosphere, along with sulfur dioxide and other carcinogens.
Communities of color and low-income communities are more likely to live near multiple sources of greenhouse gases and other pollutants. They often call these pollution-burdened communities sacrifice zones because the communities that are host to coal plants, oil refineries, and more, we sacrifice the health, the well-being, and often the very lives of our residents so that the nation can waste 80% of the energy it generates.
We knew. We couldn't say. We didn't know. Except what's certain. Benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylene, volatile organic compounds, and diesel fuel, around 1% per gallon used in the Bakken shale. Plus, the radium inert in the rocks brought back up in the fracking fluid after it's made its long journey below to gather the oil and then brought topside to be separated out and shipped to wastewater centers where it's treated, cleaned in condensate tanks, some of them lined, some unlined, seeping into the ground, toxins evaporating into the air. What's left over, uncleanable, trucked in water tankers to be disposed of, re-injected into the land previously known as a way. Beyond groundwater contamination, now earthquakes in Colorado, Arkansas, the swath of states between Alabama and Montana, a six-fold increase over 20th century levels. At least a dozen quakes last year in northern Ohio, one measuring up to 4.8 on the Richter scale, Speculation about the 30,000 disposal sites around the country where fracking wastewater is deposited, re-injected for final disposal into a deeper layer known as the basement rock. The speculation about fracking itself, deep underground explosions to extract oil, the water causing shifting plates, lubricating faults. Look for damage to homes. Look for reports of contaminated drinking water. Look for increases in breast cancer, miscarriages, birth defects. We knew. We couldn't say. We didn't know. Ground zero.
These facts alone, along with emerging evidence revealing that fracking sites and associated fracking infrastructure are disproportionately sited in non-white, low-income indigenous communities, both in the United States and in countries like Argentina, Mexico, and Canada, where fracking has been exported, means that it is right and necessary to understand the potential for human exposures and accompanying adverse impacts, not only as an issue of public health, but fundamentally as an issue of human rights.
Now, it isn't only activists calling out these human rights abuses. For the first time in history, an international human rights court has ruled that fracking and climate change systematically violate human rights. The Rome-based Permanent Peoples Tribunal Special Session on Human Rights, Fracking, and Climate Change has established the link between environmental destruction and human rights violations. Here are 4 of their central findings. First, the tribunal ruled that fracking and climate change create serious and catastrophic violations of human rights that are inherent in the industry. Here are the words from the advisory opinion.
It is impossible for the fracking system to respect rights of humans or non-humans, including those of land and water, as well as that of humans to health, life, free expression, or a clean environment. The rights violations of fracking and climate change are connected in a vicious circle. Heavy investment in fracking infrastructure militates against innovation in renewable energy. The slowing of renewables development leads to increased dependence on fracking, and so on.
So, the tribunal ruled that fracking should be banned worldwide. Second, the tribunal addressed the inherent injustice of fracking practices.
The system of laws regulating fracking is underpinned, accompanied, and permeated by racism and colonialism. The frontiers that make fracked gas cheap are constituted in part by frontiers of injustice, dividing black and white, indigenous and non-indigenous, rural and privileged urban dweller.
Fracking is economically feasible only because it legally devalues the lifeways and history of the people displaced by fracking. Thus, fracking, in the court's judgment, could not be made non-racist or non-colonialist without incurring costs that the industry is just unable to tolerate. Third, the tribunal pointed to the industry's strategies for overriding the rights and objections of people in frontline communities.
For fracking to exist, strategies for cheating, undermining, and expropriating affected communities must be coordinated in a cost-effective way across large land areas. The technical requirements for mass ruthlessness across the fracking frontier create incentives for the development and maintenance of extensive institutions for control of thought and other action. The secrecy of operations is all that allows the deadly, large-scale experiments in poisoning humans and non-humans that the fracking industry is currently conducting in violation of the Nuremberg Code.
And fourth, rather than protecting the rights of their citizens from rights violations, governments actively join with extractive corporations to permit serious violations.
Governments and extractive industries are joined in an axis of betrayal, the tribunal wrote, Such violations committed by megacorporations for the most part are done either under what have become symbolic environmental laws that have been implemented to allow practices, or in violation of such laws but with impunity from the state. Nation-states have invariably been bought off by the extractivist industries in the name of ersatz development.
The Tribunal's ruling is a global affirmation that when climate change and the extraction techniques that fuel it directly harm the rights of human beings to life, liberty, and security of person, then deeply and broadly accepted moral norms have been violated, including those encoded in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. For more about what the Tribunal's opinion means, I spoke with the co-editors of Bearing Witness, the human rights case against fracking and climate change, a book that's based on the testimony and rulings from this tribunal. The editors are Tom Kerns, co-drafter of the Declaration on Human Rights and Climate Change, and Kathleen Dean Moore, author of Great Tide Rising: Toward Clarity and Moral Courage in a Time of Planetary Change. First, I asked Kathleen about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that the tribunal cited in its opinion.
70 years ago, the world saw that when human rights violations are legal under the laws of nations, as the atrocities were in Nazi Germany, you have to have some overriding international law to call governments to account. So the nations of the world came together and reached unanimous agreement about minimal standards of human decency. They encoded them in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. For the first time in human history, it called on states to protect everyone's rights to life, liberty, and security of person. This is extraordinary, the closest the world has ever come to a global moral consensus about what is worthy of us as human beings. These are moral standards against which the world can measure the actions of governments.
I asked Tom to tell us a little about the Permanent Peoples Tribunal and how he got them to hold a special session that would measure fracking and climate change against these moral standards that Kathleen mentioned.
The Permanent Peoples Tribunal is a remarkable institution. It's politically and economically independent, which is exactly what you want in a human rights court. It was founded in 1979, about a decade after the Vietnam War Crimes Tribunals that had been organized by philosophers Bertrand Russell and Jean-Paul Sartre. That tribunal inspired the formation of the Permanent Peoples Tribunal, an international human rights court now based in Rome. In its 40-plus years of existence, hearing 40-some human rights cases against governments, it has developed an impressive body of human rights jurisprudence that it can draw on now. And its judgments are recognized and respected all around the world. Starting in 2014, and for the rest of that year, Anna Grear and I, Anna is the founder of the Global Network for the Study of Human Rights and the Environment, along with Damien Short, who's the director of the Human Rights Consortium at the University of London, began petitioning the Permanent Peoples Tribunal to take on this case. That process, back and forth, took over a year and was finally approved in the spring of 2015.
As Tom explained, this International Human Rights Court has a long history of hearing human rights cases and is well respected around the world. But an international court has no power to compel action. So I asked Tom and Kathleen what difference the ruling could make.
It is true that a civil society court like the Permanent Peoples Tribunal has no enforcement powers. The United Nations International Court of Justice also does not have enforcement powers. Public truth-telling really does matter. Giving public voice to wrongs matters. Speaking for those who have no voice matters. And the function of a tribunal is to do just that. Gandhi called it satyagraha, or truth force. It's the power of truth-telling and truth-showing to move, awaken, and compel so that as Pope Francis says, the world can hear the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. So the judge's advisory opinion makes clear that it is courts like these that help develop the critical moral and legal standards referred to in the literature as soft law. And it's soft law that helps judges in national courts to better understand and interpret and apply the harder statutes of domestic law.
This tribunal didn't mince words. It listened to the stories of the witnesses and then told the big truth that has been distorted and hidden behind lies. Which truth? This one. It makes no sense to allow an industry that is unnecessary, known not to be sustainable for the long term, and inherently abusive of human and nature's rights to continue operating. Especially, it's irrational and potentially catastrophic when we consider its inevitable contribution to climate change and water scarcity at a time when there is an urgent necessity to adopt policies that will save the planet. That's a direct quote from the advisory opinion. So what has long been considered normal corporate behavior is suddenly revealed as profoundly abnormal, irrational, and unjust. This dramatically undercuts the social license of the oil and gas industry to run roughshod over people's rights knowingly, intentionally, and systematically violated.
Let's single out a couple rights and dive into the details here. What rights in particular do fracking and climate change?
There we go. Are we back now, Tom?
We're back.
Okay. We wanted to stop the film there so that we had a little bit more time to talk with you folks. But it's important to say that the film does go on then to highlight certain rights and to make it clear how fracking and climate change violate them, using the arguments from the tribunal. That film is available to anyone free of charge. We hope you will go see it. Just go to YouTube and search for Bedrock Rights. You'll find it there. And I hope you'll show it to your friends. I hope you will send it to your children. I hope you will bring it to your church. We hope that you will find every possible way to get this message out to other people. Well, in the very short time that we have left, let's single out a couple rights and let's talk about the ways in which they're violated by the fossil fuel industry. Tom, you were going to talk about the rights to information and participation.
Yes, and I'll be quick here. I'm going to just read a section here, and under that section in our book says that the right of everyone to information about environmental matters and to participation in decision-making about environmental matters is articulated in 3 different human rights treaties. One is the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, one is the Aarhus Convention, and the other is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So I'm going to just read quickly Article 1 of the Aarhus Convention, short and quick. It says, each party, that is each government, shall guarantee the rights of access to information, to public participation in decision-making, and access to justice in environmental matters. And then finally, a word from the United Nations Environment Program, which in 2015, just prior to the Paris COP21 meetings, where the Paris Accord was signed, UNEP put together a climate change and human rights report, and in it says these 3 things. Governments must ensure that the public is, 1, adequately informed about the impacts of climate change and the measures undertaken to mitigate and adapt to it. 2, that the public, so governments must ensure that the public is adequately involved in public decisions about climate change. And 3, that the public is given access to administrative, judicial, and other remedies when those rights are violated as a result of climate change. So that's what governments require. You can make a wild guess as to how well they've done that, or you can read some eyewitness testimony about how regular people have experienced that under that right in bearing witness.
Yeah, thank you. The right that I picked out for my particular attention is the right to clean water. I've written so much about water, and I have spent so much time in the great privilege of having adequate clean water that it's particularly important to me the ways in which fracking in particular and climate change in general is affecting our right to clean water. Do we have a right to clean water? We absolutely do. The United Nations resolution says, the General Assembly recognizes the right to safe and clean drinking water and sanitation as a human right that is essential for the full enjoyment of life and all human rights. So think about what fracking does. It goes underground and it explodes in such a way that it disrupts all that subsurface geological layers, and it unavoidably spreads heavy metals and radioactive substances into the water sources that are underground. That contamination of the water cannot be measured and it cannot be reversed. These surface spills and the backflow from the fracking fluids and the problems with the lining and the slurry seals of the ponds where they put all this wastewater, that allows the migration of this polluted water into the freshwater aquifers. And that creates a great threat to the freshwater resources. And here's the part of the advisory opinion that stunned me. Of the 240 chemicals used or created during the fracking process, whose biological effects on humans have been studied, 240 have been studied. Of that number, 157 or 65% are reproductive or developmental toxins. Imagine governments allowing the fracking companies to spread those kind of chemicals into the aquifers from which people draw their water. But here's the thing that really got me. 240 chemicals have been studied. There are another 781 chemicals used in fracking that have no toxicity data whatsoever. So I did some math. If you add together the chemicals that have been studied with the chemicals that haven't, you end up with 121 chemicals that the fracking companies, the big oil, is putting into our drinking water without any idea what it is doing to us. And then I'll repeat what the advisory opinion said. It said this results in deadly, large-scale experiments in poisoning humans and non-humans that the fracking industry is currently conducting in violation of the Nuremberg Code. There's lots of other things that one could say about the threats to water fresh water caused by climate change in itself. But I would go just ending up by saying that Sandra Steingraber points out that there is no technology in the world that can turn fracking waste back into drinkable water. What does it mean, she asks, practically and morally, for humans to make fresh water disappear? And now quoting Sandra, we have never done that before. To actually remove water from the hydrological cycle, groundwater that is the mother of rivers that flow to the sea, that evaporate into clouds, that fall as rain or snow and rise again as sap or nectar, mist, and fog. We have never done that before. What could that possibly mean? Well, we should draw these. We could go on with a talk about other kinds of rights, and we hope you will look at that film. We hope you will look at the book and see the discussion of other rights. But we need to draw this to a close, Tom. What do you? What are the last kind of things you would like to say?
Well, one thing is that, as Carly pointed out in the film, these courts do not have the power to compel behavior. But what they do have is the power to change how people think and look at something. So it offers the opportunity for people to reframe what they see, to look at it through a different frame, through a different lens, the human rights lens. And with the hope that that can lead to a shift, a major shift in worldviews. Because it's shifts like that that really, in the long run, make the difference, as it did in, you know, as a moral shift in worldview that got us out of Vietnam. It was a moral shift in worldview that got the civil rights action started. It was in same-sex marriage. I mean, those were all instances in which something that looked fixed and impossible to change suddenly over a short time changed and had an effect. That's what we're hoping this human rights lens can do with climate change.
Right, right. It's a desperate hope. I think it's a last minute hope, but let's hold on to it.
Yeah.
But what strikes me is most important about this book and the movie and the advisory opinion itself is the way in which it draws a connection between social justice on the one hand and environmental justice, each being a necessary condition for the other. And let me end by quoting from the Tribunal, which said, "Today, there is a silent war by the industry with its political, financial, and media allies against the ecosystem. The assault is directed at Mother Earth, while people are collateral damage." So when you understand that we're all in this together, no matter our species or our race or our homeland or our hemisphere, you strengthen the critical alliance between activists for social justice and activists for ecological protection. And that's what we're hoping to do with this book. We hope that you will find something in here that inspires you, that empowers you, that makes you angry, that makes you hopeful, but makes you take action. So Ali, will you come and help us? Are there questions that we might address?
All right, so I'm not seeing any questions yet. So audience members, don't be shy. If you have anything you would like to ask, now is the time. Go ahead and throw those in the Q&A right at the top or bottom of your screen. In the meantime, I have a question. What was there a trail that led you to writing this book at this time? Was there, what was the spark that started this book's journey?
Kathy's going to have to answer that because she's the one who suggested that we write this book.
This all started, of course, with a call from Tom saying, we have an extraordinary thing happening. We have an international human rights court ready and waiting to try fracking and try the governments that are encouraging it, to try the governments that are not taking action against climate change in an international court based on the violation of human rights. Who do you know who could help us make that happen? And how then can we keep track of or publicize the results of that? And as a consequence, the Spring Creek Project took on the broadcasting of the trial on Zoom and the creation of the film. And Oregon State University agreed to publish a book that would detail the arguments and the evidence. And Tom has created, along with his daughter Lisa, a most extraordinary website, www.Tribunal on Fracking, that has everything you might want to find out about this trial, including recordings of the arguments.
Yeah, all the testimony. I think you cut out a little bit there, so I'll repeat that URL again. It's www.tribunalonfracking.org, and it includes literally all the testimony, video and transcribed, and all the lectures, and I mean literally everything is on that website available free.
Incredibly empowering.
Yeah.
And I just linked that in chat. So audience members, if you would like to go and track that down, there's a nice, easy little button.
Good.
You know, no, please go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that oftentimes, unless you have a question there, I will say that oftentimes people ask us as a result of listening to this and understanding maybe viscerally the wrongdoing that's going on here, with the complicity of the governments. They ask us, what can one person do? And my answer always is, stop being one person. It's a lonely thing to try to do this all by yourself, and you don't have to. The best thing you can do is pick up the phone or go online and make connection with other people who are doing this work. That is the great power that we have to organize. I often think about what is the human being's superpower. And the other, the wolves have fangs and lions have claws and lemmings have lots of children, and all these different species have different ways that they have been able to survive through the decades and the eons. In my mind, the superpower of human beings is the power to come together, to organize, and to take action together for the common good. It's what has allowed human beings to prosper and thrive and spread around the world. I think that it may be our best hope, this ability that we have to organize, not for selfish gains, not for money, but for the common good.
And one nice thing about human rights standards, of course, is that they're universal. That's important, because that means that findings in a court in one jurisdiction can have implications for a court in a totally different jurisdiction, because human rights cover the globe. And another cool thing about human rights, I think, is that governments have clear human rights obligations and can be pressured to meet those human rights obligations, which they're not meeting. And in fact, governments are not just not protecting our rights, but are abetting industries and corporations that are violating those rights. So there's something deeply wrong there. And so the human rights, what human rights brings to this, I think, is the universality and the requirement that governments follow through, because that's what governments are for. Governments are here to secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity. That's what our founding documents say in this country. And they're not doing that. So if governments aren't doing what their fundamental purpose is, then they're not meeting their reason for being. They're not, and can be called to account for that in court, in government courts, and in civil society courts. So that's
the Permanent People's Tribunal, to just give an example of that, was established during the Vietnam War, immediately after the Vietnam War, by two philosophers, Jean-Paul Sartre and Bertrand Russell, to try the United States for war crimes. Since then, they have made judgments about Bhopal, Chernobyl, many, many kinds of environmental crimes. Maybe we would say environmental sins. And so we're very proud. I'm proud of you, Tom, that you and your colleagues were able to ask again this court to speak to the issues of fracking and climate change.
Mm-hmm. We should maybe mention too that before this week of hearings that the tribunal put on 3 years ago, there were little preliminary tribunals that individuals set up in the year leading up to this. One was in Youngstown, Ohio, one was in Athens, Ohio, one was in Charlottesville, Virginia, one was in Brisbane, Australia. And there were a couple hundred people who testified at those, who came forward and with courage and fear and sobbing, told their stories of how they had been impacted. Just to hear these people testifying is profoundly moving, because it's just, they've experienced things that have ruined their lives, undermined their lives. So.
And samples of those testimonies are in the book, and they are on the website.
Yep.
So I have a couple of questions here. One from Michael, which says, in what other countries besides the US is fracking done?
Oh, Australia is heavy. places in Europe. I mean, it's undertaken in lots of places. Fortunately, there are beginning to be some places that are banning fracking. So it's a universal. The United States and Australia are two of the biggest countries that are most committed to fracking, I think.
And then this next question is from, and I apologize if I mispronounce your name, but Swellens asks, can you talk about the movement for legal rights of nature and how it relates to human rights?
Tom, do you want to do it? This was a big part of the judgment that the judges came up with, was to say that now is the time really to take very seriously the notions that things other than entities, other than human beings, like rivers or mountains, might in fact have rights, legal rights, and legal personhood, which is a phenomenon that we're seeing all around the country. Go ahead, Tom.
All around the world, yeah. I mean, the attorneys who made the case for rights of nature had, I think, 4 hours of testimony during that week, and they presented one of the most powerful collections of testimony during the whole tribunal. The judges were very impressed, and that's why the judges' advisory opinion made such a big deal of rights of nature. And in the book, Bearing Witness, there's a whole section devoted to that, to nature's rights. So, do you want to say anything about that chapter?
Well, what I was just going to give a couple examples. In New Zealand, there is a river now has rights of personhood. It can sue in its own name, and it can, if there is a settlement, that can come to its own benefit. I think the most interesting one now is that rice has been assigned in Minnesota. Rice has been assigned the rights of life, and it also is bringing suit on its own behalf against the companies that would take the water and destroy the rice fields. Most interesting expansion of moral consideration, an expansion of the view that there are entities besides human beings that are deserving of respect and consideration, and deserving of their own well-being.
Mm-hmm. Because we have a tendency as humans sometimes to look at other than human entities as instrumental value for as having, something useful for us. We call everything that's not us, we call it natural resources, as if it's just, out there for us. And there are some countries now that are putting rights of nature into their constitutions too, which gives it enormous power in those. I mean, constitutional provisions are a lot more powerful than just statutory provisions because they're fundamental to the legal structure of a country. So that's another hopeful sign.
So there are hopeful signs all around. Whether they're coming soon enough and whether they come quickly enough is the open question. But we will leave you with our thanks, our encouragement, wishing you courage, wishing you strength. Thank you so much for the work you do for the world.
Thank you.
All right, so it is about time that we call it an evening. So I just want to take this last moment to say thank you both so much for being here, for writing this book, and for doing this incredibly important work. Books like this can sort of reach out a hand and pull people into the conversation, and we really appreciate you doing that for us. To all of our audience members, thank you so for turning out. We are so happy to have you here. For everyone who would like to get your hands on copies of Bearing Witness or to check out any of the other climate work that Tom or Kathleen have done, go ahead and follow the links. I'm going to go ahead and post these again really fast so you don't have to scroll. There are those. And let's see. I think that's about all we've got for you. So both Kathleen and Tom are available for Zoom events and other collaborations. Go ahead and email this email address. There's that. And I think that is where we're going to call it a night. So Tom and Kathleen, one more huge thank you for being here and sharing your work with us. It has been such a pleasure. And I think now is the time for some awkward waving. So
thank you, Ali, and thank you to the marvelous bookstore, the Third Place Books.
I can tell you that Third Place Books is one of my favorite bookstores in all of Seattle.
Thank you.
Spent a lot of time in those stores.
Thank you. We appreciate that.
Best to all of you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Goodbye.